Introduction of myself. My name is Yuki. I'm a first year computer science student. I joined MonSec this year. Obviously, I'm a first year. And yeah, I just like cybersecurity things, and I'm doing my first presentation, hopefully. And this week, I'm going to do a very short, simple one in XXE. And what is an XXE injection? This stands for XML, external entity injection, and how this attack work is by interfering with the processing of XML data in a web application, for example. And in those applications, they use this thing called parser, and they use that parser to process the XML. This attack potentially allows the attacker to view files on the server, for example. And it can also be combined with other attacks like SSRF, which can escalate this attack into a more severe and more dangerous high-risk attacks. Yep. So XXE is not only limited to web application actually, and any software that uses XML parser can be vulnerable to this XXE injection. And as I said before, this can lead to more sophisticated attacks by combining with SSRF, as I mentioned before, to attack the internal and third-party servers, and also combine with PHP vulnerability to perform remote code execution, which is really dangerous. XXE is actually considered, it's one of the OWASP's top 10 web application security risks. I think it was top 4 when it was first introduced. Now it's part of A05, which I think it's part of system misconfiguration. And as I said before, it's not limited to web application. Duplicate sites. It's caused by misconfiguration of the server or the application or human error. So it's actually more common than you might think, even though it's a very basic attack. To do this attack, learning the anatomy of XML might be very useful. So this is the general structure of XML. And as you can see, the most important one you should pay attention to is the document type declaration here, which starts with exclamation doc type. And one down there here that starts with an ampersand called entity. What the first one is, this doc type part is called document type declaration or definition. We shorten that to DTD sometimes. This contains the information about the structure of the XML document and the data values and things. It's similar to import in a way that we can import external DTDs or external DTDs like this. We will talk about that later. DTD can be internal as well, where you define these document types, DTD things inside of this whole document. Entity is similar to variables in a typical programming sense, and it references value in the DTD using this entity name. So what this looks like in practice is if you have an entity called defined by entity name, and the entity value. From the previous example, automotive.dtd may contain something like exclamation mark entity, LT, and the value called below. So this LT will behave similarly to like variables. And you can later reference that as an ampersand of that entity name. Then the example output for this will be that, or it must be below. So difference between the syntax difference between internal and external entity declaration is minimal. It's pretty similar. An internal DTD, as seen as in the previous example, starts with exclamation mark entity name, and the entity value. For external DTD, you're going to start with exclamation mark entity again. You're going to have entity name, but this time you're going to have system as a flag kind of thing, as an argument kind of thing. And you're going to have the URI or URL of that DTD file. So for example, you can import a file from a website, web server using the domain and things. And you can actually import the local file as well using the flag URI. And you can do this entire thing in one line, starting with doc type. And then as a value, you're gonna put the entity in there. There are multiple attacks you can do with XXE injection, such as accessing or viewing local file on the server, as you probably saw here. You can actually look at the local file if it's configured wrongly. You can escalate XXE to perform SSRF attack. That is going to be another workshop, or we're not going to dive deeper into that thing. We can use PHP exploit to perform remote code execution, as mentioned before. There's also this thing called blind XXE, which does not return the value of the defined external entities in the responses that XXE gave you, XML gave you. But in this situation, you can do two different types of attack. One is out-of-band interaction technique to exfiltrate data, and another one is to trigger the XML parsing error. So it returns some kind of error, then you contain the data you're trying to get in the error message. Finally, you can also do DDoS attack with exponential entity expansion attack. We're going to look at these later on. So how would you exploit XXE? Typically, you use Burp Suite. And this is the example of how you do it. I will do the demonstration later. And the example response will be if you have a file retrieval injection here, what you will receive is that contents of the file you referenced in the entity. So there are different types of XXE payloads, and this is an example of file inclusion payload. So what they essentially did there is just define an entity called XXE system. So that's going to be an external DTD, and they reference a file at location, etc., password, like that. And when you use this reference, this entity ampersand XXE, you should get the output of the contents of this file, like you've seen in this example before. Another one is SSRF, and this is basically trying to SSRF is an attack that you do maybe on an internal server, and it's similar to the one below, one in the previous example, but this time the URL is going to be an internal server of some sort, or an API you're trying to abuse in that internal server. You can also do remote code execution using PHP expect. This is kind of an exploit, and what they do here is in the URL section, you do expect an ID in this case. And what this does, and it executes this ID command in that whatever environment they're running in, probably Linux. And this ID thing will return the context and the privilege of the user. So you can use this information later on to do further attacks potentially. And below here is an actual example of how you could abuse this this injection. Blind XXE, again, it does not return a value, but you can get around this by using thing called out of band. And basically you have a DTD in a separate DTD file where it defines the entities in a different location, for example, an attacker server, and you have this file saved on that remote server. Then in the XXE payload, you're gonna enter that DTD file. You're gonna import that file from the attacker's server, for example, in a remote location. You can also put the data in the error message by doing this and defining error, and you purposely reference a non-existent file or an existent file, and you're gonna print out the error like so. And finally, that's how you do DDoS in XXE. And this was actually a real attack that happened back in 2009. It's an old attack, but what they basically did was reference this one thing, reference it so many times, and reference this entire thing again. And this basically exponentially grows. And at the end, you get a billion low in the thing, and that will cause the parser to crash. Yeah, those are different payloads that you can do, different things you can do with XXE. And there are other techniques. There's so many different things you can do with this, like repurposing the DD to do blind XXE again. There's also a thing called SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, which is another XML protocol. You can do XXE on that. You can also embed XXE inside a SVG, and this can be useful if the web application has a file upload feature. And there's also access control bypass using PHP and X-include attacks, but we will not get into these for today's workshop. Yeah, and I will start the demo now, I think. I'll just show you how to use Burp Suite for this simple XXE attack. We're going to do a basic file retrieval. And we are not going to have much challenges on CTF.MonSec, so I recommend you going to Swigger, and they have few labs for XXE, and I recommend you going there if you want to have some practice. Right, okay. Apparently there's one challenge up already. Okay. Right, I can go there later. Now for the demo. So on your Kali machine, you want Burp Suite opened because that's the app we're going to use. And in Burp Suite, what we want to do is intercept all the connections that this browser has. So you're gonna turn the intercept on, and hopefully this catches it. Yep. So we can poke around the website and see where we can potentially attack. And we can just press forward if we can't find anything, and look at this data they return and see if there's potential XML parsing going on there seems to be a selection button here. And this, do you see that? When I press this button, you can see that they had a XML data going through this website. And we can see that there's a few things going on here. And as we seen in the presentation slides, we're going to modify this data and then send this data to the server to exploit it. Remember this. The syntax will be doc type something, and then we're gonna define the entity using exclamation mark entity and system. Then we'll try to get the local file from this server. And after we've defined this, what we can do is modify, maybe add this entity somewhere so we can see it printing. And that's going to be ampersand XXE, and we have semicolon at the end. Hopefully this works. Now you press forward, and maybe, and it said it could not check stock levels. Oh, let me redo that.
Maybe you could explain what this file is to anybody who might not know.
What the password thing shows, it basically shows all the users present in the system and the permissions they have. And yep, and that's the basic file retrieval. XXE, it should be way simpler if you know how to use this program. Yeah. I think that's all I have to show for this workshop.